Good evening. This evening I want to present to you the introduction to um, the slideshow that I'm going to record soon. The introduction to the slideshow of the Do-As-To-Tell Book 1 that I'm going to introduce to you. And there's a picture of a sort of looks like a story circle with the get phase, which is at the bottom of the story circle, which is where it should be. But let's go on to, it's going to be based on the first of the books, Do-As-To-Tell, A Gay Conservative Lashes Back, which is on my commercial channel. It's the first one published in 1997, went POD in 2000. And it's going to be based on chapters 1, 2, and 4. And I'm going to explain the themes, the philosophical conflicts, the characters, and then the story circles for the first of the three chapters that I show, which is 1, 2, and 4. And then for the entire concept of the series, I will explain later or at the end. So let me go to and this and bring up the first of the 5 panels I'm going to go through. And this is the panel on the theme of the whole film series. Again, 3 chapters. And the overall theme is how people's rights as individuals are affected when they're living in confined spaces. And there are kind of 3 instances of that, actually 4 here that I've suggested. The first is in chapter 1 in a dormitory in college back more than 60 years ago, back in 1961 when I was a freshman at William & Mary, when I was thrown out of college in November on the belief that I was a homosexual, which I had admitted in a sense, being latent homosexual, but it was thought to be a problem for young men living in a confined space that was invading their privacy. Go ahead to chapter 2, which I talk about which I set up the argument about gays in the military. I talk about my own basic training. I wound up graduating at home, going to school at home, and going to grad school in Kansas later, and then going into the Army in 1968. Chapter 2 is a very harrowing account of my basic training, special training company, and so forth. And then chapter 4 is the application of this problem about confined spaces and privacy in the military, where when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was introduced in 1993, or was proposed in 1993 by Bill Clinton, there was an argument that the privacy of service members in the barracks would be compromised at least by open gays living amongst them. And then, of course, over time we got used to that, and it was no longer a problem as eventually the policy was repealed in 2011. But today we kind of have a variation of that with gender theory, some of which I may disagree with, but there is certainly an issue for women, for biological women in their spaces and restrooms and sports and maybe prisons and maybe some other places. And so there's kind of a parallel in all of these kinds of arguments. So then the next thing I want to talk about is, and I'll go back just to refresh your memory on, that's again what a story circle looks like. But the next thing I want to talk about is the philosophical beliefs that are explored by the characters in the proposed film series. And the most important one is probably which I've labeled here as number 1, is that order and liberty are not always at odds with each other, and order and authority and absolute authority doesn't always coincide. You don't always need an authoritarian system to have order. In fact, you can have order and freedom at the same time, ordered liberty. But of course, along with beliefs, there are wants and demands made from individuals and demands made of them, which correspond to those beliefs. For example, in my case, if I like order, I may be attached to people that I see are perceived as good role models and may see as being perfect as a way of finding purity that I'd like to have myself. I might identify with it, and the danger of that would be idolatry, for example. The second principle, and this is a little bit tricky, is the idea of complementarity at inception. Now, we're used to talking about complementarity in heterosexual marriage mainly in the past. That's where we were used to talking about it. And in this case, the idea that marriage was for better or worse, for richer or poorer, and until death do us part. And then the worst thing would be divorce because something happened to one of the partners and made them less appealing. Well, the problem with somebody who doesn't get married like me, and gay marriage hasn't been around legally very long. For most of my life it wasn't, so I never really entered into one. But the problem is you need to be able to bond with someone that has some qualities you don't have, and vice versa. Anyway, if you're going to participate in society in the right way, and that kind of needs to be followed, or else society might get hollowed out. So that's another philosophical belief. Caring for your parents or caring for siblings, even if you didn't have children, is part of the picture here. The danger of, I don't know. I talk here about the danger of upward affiliation in expecting a relationship is kind of if too many people engage in that, like I did, there can be instability in society. Then the third idea is individual personal agency, which kind of breaks down into the right to privacy and what the substantive due process that was talked about in 2022 by the Supreme Court. And then the freedom of reach aspect of freedom of speech, which, whether that really should belong to the individual, or whether the individual, if he's going to speak without a gatekeeper and express his views, needs to have skin in the game, and whether he needs sometimes he or she or they needs to belong to some kind of tribe and have some kind of loyalty and be willing to fight other people's battles and join in with other people even if they don't agree with everything. And that's true today within the LGBTQ community because there's a big disagreement over the gender aspect of it, the gender theory, which has only been in the last few years. Without this willingness on the part of people to do this, you get a hollowing out of normal politics, which results in more tribalism and more extremism, and more people dropping out of more people not participating, more people in the middle not participating, leaving it to the extremes, and maybe a hollowing out of nonprofits and even of conventional businesses. As a lot of people don't play ball anymore with the system. So that's another major issue. And then finally, another philosophical issue would be the fact that people have to share risks when they come up, whether it's from war or public health, the lockdowns, the vaccine issues that we had with the pandemic, with the COVID pandemic, and also the fact that people sometimes do face sacrifice, and you hate to have the idea that what your life came to was someone else's idea, someone else's desire for power, and not yours. And that seems kind of dishonorable. You know, if I have a problem with the idea of my life were to ever be bargained for, whether it could even continue. You know, I have a problem with that myself. But anyway, those are the philosophical beliefs, and those are the wants and demands that go with the beliefs. Then we'll go to panel 3, the next panel, which are the characters that are in the would be in the proposed film, and that would start out with me as the protagonist, and then my parents, my father and mother. My father sometimes believed in authority just for its own sake, and that people had to obey even without questioning authority. My mother tended to look at things in an oversimplified way, and sometimes misread things as like being childish, like when we were making stadiums and toy cities and things, and as being childish play, when actually they probably were healthy play and masculine play and outdoor play, and not the stuff people are doing today when they're online. And then an uncle in the family who was, in an indirect way toward the end, very helpful to me and the gays in the military issue. He had served in World War II, very closely associated with D-Day, and he knew what combat was like. And he was very helpful at the end, and that'll come out in the plot. And then some of the other characters. The problem with this is it spans over 6 decades, and you don't have very many people other than myself and my mother who came all the way through all the periods and were characters all the way through. Whereas in your typical tighter screenplay, you want to have the same group of characters around for the entire time. But some high school, a particular high school friend, and a particular friend at William and Mary associated with music, and then a particular college roommate at William and Mary, you might have said was an antagonist for a while. You might say the Dean of Men was an antagonist, and possibly in a dramatic sense, the therapist at NIH later on were, when I was a patient in 1962, where you could see as antagonists. And in part 2, when I was at graduate school, the department head and a student who had cheated on a test would kind of figure into the play. And then in the Army, the whole basic training thing, which was very harrowing, some of the cadre could be characters. And then in part 3, when we deal with the military band itself, some of the service members affected by Don't Ask, Don't Tell come into the picture. Then the last 2 panels I just want to present are the story circle charts, the Harmon circle charts. We call them Harmon circles based on, a creator for Rick and Morty. Remember, we've gone over that on my blogs before. There are various other screenplay structure algorithms that's online. I happen to belong to Tyler Mary's practical screenwriting group, and he really talks about this a lot. But there are number of sites that talk about this Binder, Studio Binder, and Film Courage, and so forth. So you can look at a lot of them, and you'll generally find these kinds of ideas in screenwriting. But we'll talk about the story circle here, and I'll talk about it for the episode 1, and then I'll talk about it very briefly for the entire series. With episode 1, they start with me, and there's a long prologue identifying me, how I grew up, how I became a good student and took piano and got interested in composing, but how I had a lot of problem with physical education with dyspraxia, and some of the hobbies, collecting records was important, and the family travel and so forth, how I built an identity. And that started to change in high school, particularly in my senior year. What I wanted, well, one concrete idea that's kind of, because what you want in a screenplay is supposed to be external. One of the things I wanted was to be was possibly to, at least as an avocation, compose things and also collect. If I collected a record or a CD later on, I felt like I kind of owned my instance of the music, not in a copyright sense, but just in my own sense of the experiencing of the music. So collecting things kind of became important. That was something I wanted. That's kind of external to me. But the other thing was that I wanted my friends, I wanted to be affiliated with male friends who were role models in every way, and that included physically. And for a long time, I did not see that as necessarily erotic or homosexual. But then in high school, as I got older, I started to realize that it probably was. And then stage 3, the go step, or the you can also call it the react step. There was a particular incident late in the summer of after my senior year, before going away to college, where I did feel something unusual when around someone, and that woke me up, and that made me much more focused on what I wanted with friends when I went away to college, and that perhaps created some issues when I went away to college, and that'll be covered in the future slideshow. But that was the sort of the go step. I'll also just say that the part of the want step was set up by some field trips with the Science Honor Society when I was in high school in my senior year. That kind of set it up, and you might say that added to the want phase as well as the music and everything. That intensified the kind of socialization that I wanted. So I sort of, in a sense, was seeking that in a way, but I went and it kind of built. There was some tension with the roommate over certain things. One of the things that I didn't go to the hazing ceremony and some other stuff. But we get to step 5. The parents came to visit me at Thanksgiving with the other friend I had made who was a musician. Took him out to dinner, and then they went on to visit friends in Charlotte. And I got called in by the dean on Friday night, and I wound up being removed from school. The details will be in a future video, but that led to step 6, which was the take step, or in my case you could call it the provocation step. I got expelled from William and Mary, and then my father had a mild heart attack later, and there was a lot of tension in the family. But the action was gradual. Over time, we solved the problems, and this isn't as dramatic as maybe you would like. We solved the problems. I was a patient in NIH for a while in 1962, but then I got a job, and then later on earned my own living for a year and so forth, while going to school at night, and later on graduated. And I would say the change step, the thing that actually helped me, particularly like in 1964 when I was having some other problems that came back, was the chess club. And for about 6 months, and the last part of 64 and into 65, I was going to the chess club at GWU every Friday afternoon. I was getting much better at chess very quickly. So that's kind of the end of episode 1 as far as how the story circle works. And then I can go to just the last panel here, which is the story circle for the entire series, as opposed to for just from the first episode or chapter 1, because the entire series fractals into separate episodes, and even within each episode you can fractal each act and draw a circle. We won't get into that here, but I'm me in step 1. In step 2, I talk about what I needed was upward affiliation, a little bit, and avocation as a composer. But here, the initial when I go to college, the initial problem is getting expelled, because you have 3 acts, so the steps of the story circle are compressed and they're much larger, cover much more territory, each one. And then the seek step, which is 4, was getting degrees, as I explained in the further one. Step 5 was teaching in grad school and getting a sense of power and achievement over other people, being able to grade other people. But that led to a crisis when I was drafted myself, which is step 6. And step 7, which is really, I finally came out for good a second time, and some of this doesn't really have to do with the confined spaces idea, but I moved to New York, then later on lived in Texas, attempted a relationship. I did not get HIV when I was living in Dallas, but I became kind of a controversial figure in Dallas publicly, even without the internet. And then later on, I changed. I came back into Virginia, and then how I happened to write the book. I was working for a company that dealt with the military, and that created a very interesting situation. How all that happened is a story in itself, the potential conflict of interest. But the end result was I went to Minneapolis for 6 years. I came back after the final retirement, had to look after her, and when she died the same weekend that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. And so that kind of rounded things out as far as a conclusion. So that is the sequence or the sequence of events as you would see it, as you would present it in a story circle. So that's and also the philosophical changes. My father became less authoritarian. He began to realize there were limits on authority as to how it should be used. So that was a philosophical change in his part. I guess I became a lot more knowledgeable, yet I became very double-edged in my views about things. In some way, I remained a very strict individualist. I still believe you should own your own problems and not simply claim to be a victim of an oppressed group. And that's still a very important idea to me personally. That hasn't really changed. My mother gradually sort of got over her idea of oversimplifying things, even as she got older and she had to be taken care of. That might be the other philosophical change I noticed. And my uncle was interesting too, and we'll get into that in the longer screenplay. But that's the outline I wanted to impart with you tonight, and I do thank you for listening.